Development with the BC Ministry of Jobs, Economic Development and Competitiveness. Selena has a strong background in economic development, the natural resource sector, program management, and policy development. She has supported the development of the province's economic plan and the work of the Food Security Task Force, and is very much focused on the province's agri-tech file. Evan Fraser is Professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security at the University of Guelph and Director of the Arrell Food Institute. He works with large multidisciplinary teams to develop solutions to feed the world's growing population. He's written for so many journals and newspapers, including the Globe and Mail, The Guardian, CNN, Foreign Affairs, The Walrus, and the Ottawa Citizen, and has 2 popular nonfiction books about food and food security. He's a researcher, co-authoring over 100 academic publications, and has played a leadership role in teams that have raised over 100 million in research funding. And he tells me it's very beautiful in terms of weather in Ontario now, and in British Columbia, we're all very envious. Annett Rozek is the Chief Scientific Officer at Terramera. She's an accomplished scientist and visionary leader. And alongside the founder and CEO, she launched the company's inaugural Proof and Circle products and developed the aggregate targeted performance technology, which has a goal of reducing global synthetic pesticide loads by 80%, increasing global farm productivity by 20%, and increasing soil organic carbon 100% by 2030 to protect plant and human health and ensure an earth that thrives and provides for everyone. And we're also joined by Hsiao, who's professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, affiliated researcher at the BC Centre for Disease Control Public Health Laboratory, and a genomic consultant with the BC Ministry of Agriculture Animal Health Centre. Through Food On, William and his multidisciplinary teams work to standardize food vocabulary to support routine surveillance and outbreak analysis of foodborne pathogens, which are being adopted by the USDA Good Data Central. He builds tools and international data standards to improve the health and well-being of humans and animals, and solves public and animal health problems through a One Health lens. I'm sure you'll agree that we have a stellar panel with us today. On behalf of Simon Fraser University, please, thank you for joining us. We're also joined by an SFU alum, Sam Brad, a graphic facilitator from Drawing Change. This conversation, not only is it being recorded, it will be audio-wise, it'll be graphically recorded. So you'll be able to see our dialogue and ideas drawn in real time. And Sam will join us at the end of the session to reveal his portrayal of what we've talked about. And Leila Benkrima, Director of Program Development of Agricultural Technology at SFU, is joining me. And she's going to help monitor the Q&A portion of our session today. You'll note there is a Q&A session in the bottom of the window, and one nice thing about this feature is that you have the option to upvote questions already asked using the thumbs up, or write your own. And we encourage you, because we have a fairly large panel, to, if you'd like to ask a question to a specific panelist, please do so. And at the end of the panel session, we'll answer selected questions live. For any comments or technical questions, just post them to chat. Now, I'll quickly set the stage for a discussion. Without question, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted food security and supply chains and vastly altered the landscape of our food system. But we now have very high awareness of the importance of food security by the general public. And this disruption offers us an opportunity to rethink our approach to agriculture by leveraging our innovation, infrastructure, and technology to build a food system that can achieve food security, lower our carbon footprint, and maintain the health of our crops and livestock. It's estimated by the Food and Agricultural Organization that feeding a world population of over 9 billion people in 2050 would require raising overall food production by 70%. We're going to have to do this without using more land while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To tackle these challenges, innovation in agriculture is essential, and investing in technology can be part of the solution. Canada is uniquely positioned to be a global leader in agri-tech. We have a thriving agricultural sector, a strong innovation infrastructure, and a very growing technology startup scene in areas such as remote sensing, robotics, AI, and machine learning, just some of the technologies being used in agri-tech. According to Royal Bank of Canada in 2019, they estimated that Canada could gain $11 billion in annual GDP by 2030 by closing the agricultural labor gap and accelerating investment in technology, investment in use of technology, I should add. On the West Coast, on the chilly West Coast, our research institutions are working collaboratively and directly with all levels of government and large and small agri-tech companies and farms. Our experts in R&D infrastructure are developing new ways to combat climate change and improve the sustainability of our agri-tech food systems. While the consumption of energy by the agricultural sector increases, energy use per inflation adjusted output is declining, and new energy efficient technologies are being adopted. We're leveraging all of our strengths at SFU and agri-tech to meet the demands of the fourth agricultural revolution by ensuring that agricultural productivity is improved and more sustainable, underpinning long-term food security. We're also applying the power of AI, big data, robotics, and ICT to help solve some of the biggest challenges in agriculture today. It's through our collaboration with industry, government, nonprofits, that institutions in BC and the larger agri-tech system across Canada can deliver much needed cutting edge research and innovation, as well as tackle barriers through policies and programs. I'm so excited at our panel today because, and this opportunity to explore Canada's potential future as a leader in agri-tech. We're going to, in the next 80 some minutes, we'll dive into promising agri-tech innovations, suggest how Canada can bring stronger bridges between our technology communities and the agricultural sector, and identify areas that have great potential for policy innovation. So enough talking by me. I'm going to turn it over to our expert panel and begin by asking each of them to share their thoughts in 2 minutes. I know that's not a lot of time, to answer the question that in Canada, given our climate infrastructure, our land mass and current strengths, what would you consider to be the low-hanging fruit when it comes to our potential to lead in agri-tech and address climate change? We'll start with Selena.
Thanks, Joanne. So great question. So I'm here located in British Columbia, where we have a very climate-friendly policy environment. And so when it comes to low-hanging fruit, as it were, I think that we've got a real opportunity to leverage our BC brand, our brand of sustainability and clean BC, not only to develop technologies that align with sort of clean tech and carbon reducing technologies for the sector, but also just to kind of spread that banner of sustainability across what we do in terms of food production and the development of technologies. Smart and sustainable packaging is one area that I think we could also build a name for ourselves in. With, of course, the pandemic as of late, we've had to move again to more single-use types of materials. And so going back to looking at innovation in the types of packaging and materials that can meet the safety standards that are required in sort of today's environment, but applying that innovation to make sure that we are still keeping in mind our climate policy goals, I think is a great opportunity in terms of a near-term implementable piece for British Columbia. I think overall, when it comes to having that brand of sustainability, I believe with your comments, Joanne, you mentioned that people are paying more attention to food security. People are paying more attention to supply chains and where that comes from. And I don't think that we can ignore that we are reliant, as are many jurisdictions, on imported food that is trucked here. And when you truck food, that does create GHG emissions. So by localizing a healthy and robust supply of food, I believe that we also have an opportunity to address our climate goals in that regard and show other people how that's possible. Again, going back to the pandemic, we can't ignore that everyone staying at home and not driving their cars every day was a good thing for our climate goals. And it really did open our eyes to a different way of doing things. So for British Columbia, which in itself is a large province in terms of geographical distance from urban areas, the growing areas such as the Fraser Valley, where most of our food is grown in an intensive fashion, to parts of rural and remote British Columbia, that's a long way to go in a truck or a vehicle. So looking at using the power of technology to harness localized food supply is a great opportunity that I believe technology can unlock. And so I really do think, in terms of answering your question, our low-hanging fruit is leveraging our brand, localizing our food supply, and being able to demonstrate from Canada and from British Columbia how other parts of the world can follow that model.
Great, thank you, Selena. Evan, you've been working in this field for decades. I'm interested in your answer to this question.
So, I mean, not to mix our metaphors up, to answer the low-hanging fruit question, let's start at the high level. And I think the high level really is the series, almost a drumbeat, a steady drumbeat of governmental reports from the last 4 years that lay out what I would consider a pretty exciting vision for the sector and for our country. And the first of the government reports was the so-called Barton report, the Advisory Council for Economic Growth, that was followed up by the industry growth tables or strategy tables. Selena's own task force on food security from the BC Premier's office, the Senate of Canada's value-added food sector, and then big investments like in the protein innovation supercluster in the prairies, and even the project that I'm involved in, which is a big research project called Food from Thought. And the thing that draws a red thread through all of these is that Canada can do well by doing good. We can grow our exports, but we can also grow our value-added exports. We should double down on being trusted, safe, and sustainable. Those are the three adjectives that come up again and again. We should bring supply chains closer to home using technologies to do that. And if we do all this, we will see not only big environmental benefits in terms of decarbonizing our supply chains and enhancing biodiversity, but we'll grow our GDP, we'll provide unemployment for the youth. And in doing so, we'll be a global leader in tackling what I would consider one of the century's biggest challenges, which is reconciling the need to produce more food for the growing human population without destroying the ecosystems on which we depend for life. But like I said, I'm an academic. You don't have to take my word for it because this is my chosen study. You can take things like the Advisory Council's report or the industry strategy table or the Senate. All those things, all those reports provide a consistent vision for our country. And I think we now need to realize that we have to implement that vision. The time for visioning is probably past. We've spent a lot of energy in the last 4 years creating these visions at different scales. Now I would like to see us do those visions. And so I really hope that as a country, we can realize these visions. That's it for me for now, though.
Great, thanks, Evan. A good point that this has been a very large area of activity for the last number of years, and COVID-19 has just made it more, there's more awareness in both the public as well as the political sphere of the importance of the sector and innovations in the sector. I'll turn it over to Annett now.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for painting that wonderful picture of government, academia, and industry partnering on making Canada a leader in this field. And so from vision to action, Evan, I think the low-hanging fruit for Canadian agri-tech is greenhouse automation. So here, like from a technology perspective, right, we already have a prolific horticultural industry in Canada, and the automation can take that to the next level. And really, if we look abroad, the Netherlands have applied that with great success. Their exports per acre of farmland are 150 times higher than in Canada. And so through the greenhouse automation, we could increase our production tremendously for our own consumption and for export. And, you know, given the landmass we have, we can have many, many multiples on what the Netherlands has been able to make happen. And there's a social aspect on this too. Indoor growing systems can be a great opportunity to expand horticulture into the northern regions of Canada. So if you think, for instance, of indoor growing systems inside fully environmentally controlled containers, and that would bring fresh produce to northern communities, indigenous communities, for having local food, local fresh food there. And it would also open up exciting opportunities in technology education in these areas and for these communities. There would be opportunity for new partnerships and new high quality jobs.
Great. Thanks, Annett. Will, last but not least.
Hi, so as Joanne mentioned, I'm an infectious disease genomic scientist who's interested in using genomics and information technology to improve human and animal health. So my thought about this question naturally fall at the interface of infectious disease and food safety and food security. And I guess there's no more timely time, I guess, to talk about this topic. And so to me, the low-hanging fruit is to create a better surveillance system for infectious diseases, for to guard against our food production, to guard against our food distribution. So for example, one of the projects that I'm currently working on that's funded by Genome BC, by CFIA, and by the BC Ministry of Agriculture and other federal partners, is to create an early warning system for avian influenza. So avian influenza, incursion of avian influenza into our poultry population has cost millions of dollars. So back in 2015, when there was an outbreak in the Fraser Valley, large portion of the poultry population have to be culled and cost an estimate of $300 million in that single year. And soon after that, we were tasked to look at, can we detect these viruses, which usually get introduced into the poultry population through migratory wild birds. But capturing the wild birds and detecting viruses directly from the birds is a very labor-intensive and time-consuming process. So we came up with the idea of looking in the habitat of these birds to detect the viruses. And it's very much like finding a needle in a haystack type of activity. But using modern genomics technology, we were indeed able to find the genetic materials of these flu viruses in the environment and correlate that to the birds that are carrying the viruses as well. So in order to show that indeed these viruses are present in our environment. The other important thing is that viruses are not all created equal. Some cause diseases, severe diseases like SARS-CoV-2, others very much cause mild disease with no disease at all. So the other use of genomic technology allow us to detect and also to characterize the viruses more so than the current approach. But in short, combining genomic technology and improving our ability to detect viruses allow us to set up a better surveillance system to be able to detect the viruses early from the environment or from other sources before they incur into the animal production facilities and other critical points. So to me, while this may not be the lowest of the hanging fruit, because there's still R&D required to improve this technology, it is an area worth undertaking given the cost effectiveness of doing surveillance vastly outweighs the cost of dealing with an outbreak aftermath. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Will. That's a good reminder that the food and agri-tech is working within a system. And I also wonder about the mink farms in Europe, and just, like there's a lot of worry, and the idea of surveillance makes a lot of sense using genomics. Well, thank you all. And I think this was a good question because it really did demonstrate the various areas of expertise and the diversity of our panel today. And, in terms of low-hanging fruit, and we aren't avoiding using analogies to do with agriculture. But, just the idea of brand, localized food supply, also mentioned about value added as a real opportunity. And then it was interesting, our last areas of, the kind of sweet spots or the sort of specific areas such as indoor growing systems. And thanks, Annett, for pointing out social systems and just the benefit of food supply to all regions of Canada. And ending with Will's comments as well. So that was a nice initial question. I do have a few more questions for our panelists, but I encourage participants to start using the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. We will start to monitor that. But while we're waiting for people to formulate questions of our panel, and as mentioned, you can ask one panelist or you can just say all, and we'll try to get to a number of them. But, we've been talking about the tremendous potential and areas of potential, but what are the barriers to agri-tech adoption by farmers and growers? And where could advances in agri-tech have an impact? And I think I'll ask each of you that, and maybe starting from reverse, maybe we'll ask Will first and sort of a reverse order. So Will, what are the barriers? And I know you work in a very particular area of surveillance and genomics, but what do you foresee as the barriers to adoption?
So just to sort of pick up from where I left off, I think while we're developing these new technologies, the cost of doing the R&D is certainly a barrier, because without the R&D, we won't be able to implement the solutions. But in short, I think cost is a major concern in agriculture and agri-tech, given that the margin of profit in agriculture is traditionally quite low, and to introduce new technologies that may be helpful but not in a cost-effective manner will lead to no adoption of technology, regardless how good the technology may be. So, and also the other consideration for barrier adoption is that smaller operators may not have the capital to adopt new technology. So to introduce new technologies, the technology should also be scalable, so it could be adopted by both small and large operations. So back to the area of pathogen detection, what we have been focusing on then is to develop portable devices that are cheap to manufacture and allow the technology to be deployed into the field. The main challenge associated with these low-cost alternatives, however, is that they're typically finicky to operate still at the moment, and to improve their robustness and reliability is a key challenge that the field is facing. We know that in the field it's not the same as in the lab. There's more likelihood of contamination. There's more likelihood of temperature variation and all sorts of, or even humidity variation, all sorts of variables. And how do we improve the control of these variables in order to deploy these highly sensitive devices into the field is indeed a technology challenge. And I do see that it's something that can be overcome and over time. So back to the question, I think the barrier of adoption really resides on scientific ingenuity in creating low-cost, scalable, and deployable devices to allow on-site testing, to allow the testing to be done more frequently, so the diseases can be detected more frequently. And it's not just genomic tests, of course, that's what I'm most familiar with, but there are other other technologies, such as imaging technologies, that can be used to detect diseases and to detect pathogens as well. So collectively, scientists are working in improving these technologies so they're more reliable and deployable into the field. And the advancement of these technologies then will allow us to identify pathogens more, hopefully more quickly and more reliably. I should also mention that a lot of these technologies are based on detecting specific targets rather than detecting the pathogen as a whole. Whereas genomics actually allow you to detect non-specific targets and detect the pathogen genome as a whole. And the combination, but genomic technology is typically more expensive than the targeted detection-based methodology. So a smart combination of these two would also improve the lowering of the costs and help us to deploy advanced technology in combination with existing technologies.
Great.
So I'll stop
Thanks.
there. Thanks.
I know you were speaking to a particular area, but I could see the comments about cost-effective, scalable be applicable for any agri-tech innovation.
Right.
Annett, I imagine at your company, you think a lot about barriers to adoption. And I know we said farmers and growers. That sounds like like it's a broad category, but how would you answer this question?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the notion that cost is one of the main barriers to adoption. Farming is quite a low margin business, and trying out new technology creates risks that the farmers cannot afford. There's only one chance per season to get it right. However, there's also another barrier that's been cited by farmers themselves, is that they don't even have enough training or education and perhaps time to learn how to use all these new tools, right? So A, there's the cost of buying them, and B, there's the time and learning that it takes to test them out in the field and try and make sense of the data, right? And oftentimes, data analytics companies, they give prescribed solutions to the farmer, which is really, I think, not in the interest or in the the self-understanding of the farmer. And so we, as an industry, we want to, and very much as Terramera, want to provide options to the farmer rather than telling them what is the right thing to do. We would like to make a recommendation, but then the farmer can draw from all the knowledge that they have to, make the choices that they think is best for their operation. And so with that, really, we want to put the farmer in the driver's seat. I think of the farmer as the scientist. The farmer is the scientist. The modern farmer is a very tech-savvy person, and they care deeply about the land and the soil. They're stewards of the land. And we can give farmers the tools to make these data-driven decisions to maximize productivity in every corner of their field. And they know their fields the best. And I think the government policy can de-risk using those new tools by providing incentives that, gives them, relieves the strain on the cost as well as the time, and fills in the gap on the education. And so here's I think a social aspect to that too. Using digital technologies will attract young people back into agriculture. We have experienced kind of a drain of young people away from agriculture. They're going to the cities, and there has been like an increase in the average age of the farmer. And we, by bringing agri-tech to agriculture or technology to agriculture, we can reverse that trend. We can make agriculture cool again.
That's great. Thank you. Evan.
Yeah, happy to. So great conversation. Thank you for everybody. Let me start with an anecdote that maybe I think illustrates some of the scale of the changes, because I'm mindful that probably a lot of the audience members maybe don't have a background in agriculture. And so if I go back to the dark ages of the 1980s, when I would spend summers on my grandfather's fruit farm in Niagara, one of my jobs was to stand on the back of the tractor and throw handfuls of fertilizer off the tractor as Grandpa would sort of drive slowly through the melons and the sweet corn and strawberries. And I don't know, with the benefit of hindsight and a PhD in agriculture, I'm going to say that half of that fertilizer probably didn't land in the right place or at the right time for the plants to utilize. And so it became pollution. And that fertilizer would have either gotten to Lake Erie, where it fed an algae bloom, or probably some of it today is as a greenhouse gas. but of course, things are really different. Terramera, the Annett's company, is working on green chemistry platforms that make inputs much more effective. Smart tractors know where they are in the fields, and using what's called variable application technology, put the right seed in the right place and give it the right amount of fertilizer, unlike me just chucking handfuls off the back of the tractor. Robotic milkers allow for much more precise use of things like antibiotics to keep cows healthy. And so my prediction, I think the prediction of everybody on this call, is that in the next 5 years, we're going to see tremendous shifts. Indoor agriculture, like Annett mentioned, the genomic tools Will mentioned, but these technologies aren't panaceas, and we need to have policies to reduce barriers. And Annett just mentioned de-risking investments. I completely agree with that. Let me jump into one more really big barrier. And the digital agricultural revolution will, much like the digital revolution in general, be driven by huge amounts of data that have to be integrated and result in smarter, newer, more efficient ways of doing things. But this will only happen if, from a data management perspective, data drawn from all sorts of sources can be integrated. And so this generates or ties into the big area of data interoperability. And so if there's any sort of aspiring computer scientists out there, data interoperability in agriculture is going to be a huge issue that creates a barrier. Related to data, we also need governance systems around data, such that the people who produce the data, such as the farmers, actually get a share in the benefits of all this data revolution. And I can assure you right now that many farmers and farm groups are really suspicious of large corporations that harvest the data from their tractors and even sell tractors to farmers with data sharing arrangements that say the farmers don't own the data they create. And then the corporations sell it back to farmers in the form of subscription services. And, those big questions around data governance that we have to work through. And in this regard, I think agriculture and ag food is behind other sectors in having the data governance conversation. And third and finally, related to data, we need data systems to make sure our food system is cyber secure. I'm aware of poultry farms where the remotely controlled ventilator systems have been hacked by malicious cyber criminals and transformed into ransomware attacks. And so, again, we're having the cybersecurity conversation in financial and defense sectors. We're not having it yet in agriculture. And if we move to an internet-enabled food system, we need it to be secure. So, without getting into the details, I just want to put on the table that the broad area of data interoperability, data governance, and cybersecurity are a major barrier, one of many barriers, but an illustrative barrier of the sort of things we have to work on as a society if we want this digital ag revolution, or ag 4.0, or whatever we want to call it, actually come to be.
Great, thank you, Evan. A lot of new areas that I hadn't considered. Selena, what do you feel are the major barriers? And you feel free to comment on any of the previous panelists if you wanted to elaborate on any theme as well.
Sure. So certainly an agreement with all of the comments that we've heard. All of that is certainly things that I've heard over the years working in this sector with innovators and with farmers. And I think just the fact that I have to say that is indicative of one of the barriers to moving this forward. Innovators and farmers, whereas Annett's mentioning, the farmers are the scientists, and whether that's today's farmers or the farmer of the future, what I think is one of the barriers is that we've got a bit of a divide between agri-tech companies developing things that would be good for farmers and then going to farmers and asking them to, participate in trials and demonstrations. I think we need to have a much more systematic and collaborative approach to move past those barriers that have been discussed so far. Some of those barriers that I've observed include, when you're talking about some piecemeal technologies, an agri-tech company develops a sensor that's going to improve water monitoring to a crop. Another company has done something that's going to manage a pest issue. Another one still is going to be able to kind of track your farmhand or your labor that's using it. It's not yet integrated. And so it's really difficult, what I've heard, for a farmer to understand how do all of these different technologies, some are, you know, software as a service, some are they have to purchase something. It's really hard to actually see what that benefit is. And it's not going to be overarching, immediate, overnight benefit. It would be incremental with the purchase of each new technology. That would be difficult. So I think we've really got to step back to overcome the barriers of perceived challenges with adoption, perceived challenges or real challenges in terms of the cost of adoption. Because as Evan's saying, right now, we're not really able to drive home how that benefit here in British Columbia helps a smaller scale farmer. And we don't have an integrated approach. So I think that weaving all of this together and then making sure that you're understanding that if you are working in a plugged in internet managed system, this is secure and it will drive a range of benefits. And there is a skilled workforce there to actually see that benefit for you. I think we'd see some more conversion of existing farms. The other opportunity, I think, is when we're talking about the application of technology into the existing agriculture system. That's one sphere. But when we talk about the farmer of the future, as Annett's mentioned, these are people that are already going to be tech savvy. They will lead with the technology, and it'll be the technology that gets them excited about entering into food production. So I think there will be less barriers there, but the same barriers will exist in the piecemeal approach of putting together different products to be able to grow your farm. So I think that there's a role here, certainly for us that are involved in the sector, to look at integration and making a more solution-friendly approach for farmers that are existing farmers or future farmers. The other thing I guess I would mention is that when I talk to farmers about, well, it would increase your productivity, as Annette's mentioned, by significant amounts per hectare. Some farmers say to me, well, I don't want to be more productive because I'm already growing everything I can sell. I don't have a way to get it out of the location where I live. I don't have sort of a logistics approach. And I know that in some jurisdictions where they do have that enhanced productivity, they're always talking about the technology to increase the productivity, the quality of the product, and then how that product is going to get somewhere that's going to return a profit. Because I think it's difficult to sell a story on someone that you're going to increase your profitability just through technology. You've got to look at it in the systematic approach. And so I think that as we are now at this time for implementation, we've got to bring more of the actual growers, existing or future, into the conversation to make sure that they see sort of that whole integrated cycle of how this is going to go from plugging in an input to analyzing the data to getting whatever it is you're producing out to the people that are going to pay you. So that would be sort of some of the ways I think agri-technologies across the spectrum can support overcoming those barriers.
Great. Well, that was a really good discussion highlighting some of the major barriers to adoption. I will move to a question around policy development and innovation, but first I'm going to move to one of our questions in the Q&A from Sarah. And I think it was Annette that had mentioned about growing in the north, and she comments about the major issues in affordable access to food in the northern regions of Canada due to high overhead and costs of transportation, and talking about orange juice being 10 times the cost of a city purchased orange juice. And so local fruits can be grown in the north, but then she's curious if there are currently efforts from a public policy perspective or from private innovative sectors to tie the northern regions more closely to achieve more affordable access to groceries. So all four of you don't need to answer this, but is there some? I see Evan's got his hand up, and I'll look for hands of other panelists to answer this question.
So I think this is a wonderful question, because on one hand, there's tremendous opportunity for technologies like controlled environment agriculture to play a major role in areas which don't have good long-term growing seasons. And the North, which could be defined as all of Canada, but especially the Canadian North, is theoretically ripe for these kinds of technologies. But there are a number of very important caveats and nuances that we need to also be thinking about. First of all, rates of food insecurity in Canada's north are partly due to remoteness, but also partly due to poverty and mental illness, colonialism, very, very tough social issues. And so it would be a bit of a misnomer or a bit simplistic to think that simply building high-tech greenhouses in the Northwest Territories would actually address or provide a meaningful change on people's food security. It might, but there's a lot more going on than simply producing salad locally. So that's the first thing I'd say. And then the related thing is, in my experience and more of my observation of food security programs in the North, whenever a settler or a Southerner comes in with a good idea, it usually doesn't work. And what we need to be thinking of is how to empower Northern communities to make their own decisions, how to support Northern communities and Northern entrepreneurs who actually are the people who are affected by the social issues and are aware of the opportunities and the constraints of working in those environments. And so I'm aware of some Indigenous-led entrepreneurial groups which are investigating these technologies, and those projects seem to actually play a meaningful role. I'm also aware of a lot of well-meaning Southern-led development projects that have built high-tech greenhouses in the North that haven't worked at all. So it's a real important point of how the process of deploying the technology unfolds in a way that's led by Northern and Indigenous communities, where the scientist in the South, or the person with access to the technology, plays a much more humble and supporting and listening role. And in that model, I think things can be quite exciting, and I've seen some quite exciting stuff.
Great. Selena, just curious, because the BC Food Security Task Force activities and report is fairly recent. Did it tackle the issue of BC's North or the Indigenous communities? And I know Ministry of Agriculture has a table now of First Nation chiefs that are discussing these kinds of issues, but did it come up in your deliberations?
Yes, so certainly it did come up in our deliberations. The task force work was time limited, so there wasn't an actual opportunity to talk to, every component of this important conversation. So it is really great that work is continuing on. But the task force did visit some rural parts of British Columbia, and certainly did see that, as Evan is talking about, there's an opportunity to empower increased growing in northern parts of the province. But certainly in our regional engagements, we heard exactly what the audience question is referring to, and that not only are you paying more for fresh produce or freshly packed products in those parts of our province, but also oftentimes the quality is not what it were. So you're paying, 3 times more for a nearly spoiled piece of fruit. So we did talk about the power of the technology to be located in those parts of the province and what distribution channels could look like. But unfortunately, we didn't come up with an actual, the task force didn't have a recommendation related to this. Instead, they looked at the opportunity. So it's a conversation that we would like to create the policy space for here in British Columbia, look at the affordability issues and the access issues, but also from an economic development perspective, in making it possible for some Indigenous groups to become the producers and suppliers of food, which could potentially address the affordability component as well.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move and I'm going to ask a general question in the policy area. I'm just again encouraging people to use the Q&A for further questions. But if each of the panelists can talk about the policies or policy areas that you think should be advanced in Canada based on your expertise and knowledge, and particularly your knowledge of programs in other jurisdictions, other countries, and unique perspectives. I always get the question of where in the world we should emulate, and I hear different answers to that. And just if there's any current provincial or sector policy that's working out well now in an important area that we should consider scaling. And geographically, across sectors. So I'm leaving it as a very broad question, and hope that participants will use Q&A if they want to delve in a bit to specifics. But Annett, I might, just from your industry perspective, but just kind of the policy areas that should be advanced in Canada, and just where in the world that your company looks to where things are working in a very advanced manner.
Yeah, so kind of thinking about what all the panelists have been saying, I think creating streamlined policies that connect Canadian farmers with the research, with the education, and with the technology creators will generate that kind of supercharged partnership that we need to really create the right technologies, comprehensive technologies like that, work together as an integrated system for the benefit of the farmer. And so Terramera, actually, I don't know if you've heard, but we're just spearheading this initiative to create a global center for regenerative agriculture. And that center is trying to accomplish just that. So it will be a combination of research institutions, or a range of labs and growth chambers that create and test new technologies. And it will also create the bridge to the farmer to implement those technologies in the right way. And with the government's help, providing incentives to the farmers to try out these new technologies, we can provide that that source of and the space for innovation in Canadian agriculture that is needed to make us truly a leader in this field. And there's an environmental aspect to this too, and there's like a greater benefit, global benefit, which is that agriculture can really turn back the clock on climate change by increasing the soil organic carbon. And the way that works is that, if you bring back the microbiome, the microorganisms in the soil, they, through the plant, will pull back carbon dioxide from the air, and resulting in better soil and better plant production, more healthier plant production. So in this way, we can achieve two things, or three things even at the same time, because the third one is that the agriculture industry as a whole will do much better. And so this will contribute to our economic growth, and if you will, to COVID recovery as well.
I know, Annett, you're currently working with universities, and I've seen your company's projects as part of the digital supercluster, but also the center that you're working on. Are there particular areas that you think universities should be focusing on now, or are you seeing are universities being responsive and sort of approaching the correct areas?
I think universities can play a crucial role in enabling the farmers in using new technologies. So when, Selena has described before that for the farmer right now, it's kind of a disintegrated pictures. They're getting thrown this tool, that tool, use this data analytics, that sensor, and it doesn't come together on how to use all of this information productively together. And so by providing a system of education to the farmer, and right away, like to the, getting young people into that as a cool new technology field, the universities can create a huge opportunity and really help enable, our agriculture 4.0, right? Our next revolution.
That's great. Will, what do you see as kind of areas for potential policy innovation, or where policies can be introduced?
Yeah, so Evan's comment about data integration, data governance indeed echo with me greatly, having worked in the intersection between human and animal health. As we all know, the SARS-CoV-2 virus has an animal origin, and indeed, the estimate is that 75% of the epidemic causing pathogens have animal origin. And the crossover events between human and animal, it's actually much more frequent than we probably assumed. So it's estimated that 1 to 7 million episodes of these crossover events happen between wildlife and rural area population. Most of these, of course, did not lead to pandemic, and thankfully that it's fairly rare that these do lead to pandemic. But nevertheless, these are frequent events. And a field survey of bats in the Southeast Asia indeed back up the claim why these episodes happen so frequently. They found that 5 to 10% of the bats in Southeast East Asia have some form of coronavirus, are infected with some form of coronaviruses. And another example is influenza viruses. As I mentioned already, that they're carried by wild birds and from time to time can have incursion into domestic animals, and much more rarely, but from time to time in human population as well. So to integrate data from all these different sectors require us to speak the same data language, and this is simply not the case. So that's the technical challenge. The second challenge is that these sectors, while have working relationships, there's really no overarching policy framework to govern the data sharing across multiple sectors, namely agriculture, human health, public health, animal health, and environmental health. So to me, one urgent area in terms of policy considerations is how do we enable sharing of surveillance data across sectors, and what's the proper policy framework and the governance structure to allow that to happen, to one, allow data to be shared, but two, to also protect and acknowledge people who are sharing data, in other words, the source of data. As Evan already pointed out, people who are generating the data are often taken advantage of because they have to subscribe to get their data back, and so on and so forth. So how to change the policy framework so data providers actually get their share of benefit in the process, I think it's something to look into as well. And that hopefully will allow partners to be more willing to share data, which again will benefit the greater population.
I don't know if I want to know the answer to this, but if you or Evan could comment on the incidents at mink farms. Like, it's not getting a lot of publicity in terms of general media, but that appears to me anyway to be very worrisome.
I only have sort of cursory knowledge of that as well, so not sure how much specific comment I can make, but yeah, generally speaking, we are using blunt instruments to measure pathogenicity. We're using blunt instruments to identify and characterize pathogens. And one area that I'm passionate about is to apply genomic technology and linking. So genomics is just a blueprint of what's possible, what an organism's capable of doing. Doesn't mean that it will actually do that. So linking genetic information to the actual phenotype of the organism is an area that's severely understudied. And as a result, we have the genetic information, but we actually can't interpret it properly because we don't know what the phenotypic manifestation would be. And that's why earlier I mentioned, having contextual information about the sequences, knowing what phenotype, knowing what morphology, knowing what outcome the genetic information entails would allow us to create a linkage between the genetic information and the phenotypic information that the organism manifests. But because these are often what's called small effect, so we need a lot of data in order to make that interpretation. And this is where, again, data integration, data sharing is the key, but it needs to be done in balance with data governance, data ownership, and building trust across partnership.
Yeah, good, thank you. So Evan, I'll turn to you. I'm really interested in where you see greatest or important areas for policy innovation or adoption. And I know we look to Guelph and other Canadian centers, but I'm interested also where you think excellent work is happening in the world.
Yeah, well, thanks. And it's a super great question, and it's a fun one to brainstorm what, might be a great policy agenda. In addition to the data things that we've already talked on, let me just sort of highlight 4 key areas where I think policy work would really help uncork the bottle and let the ag revolution champagne flow freely. And the first is in the broad area of land use planning. And this really does pick up on some of what Will just said about One Health and the need for holism. So let me explain. If one of the benefits of the digital agricultural revolution is to give us ability to produce more food on less land, thus sparing land for biodiversity, we actually are going to have to do the land use planning and spare areas for biodiversity. So if we're going to build a fancy greenhouse to produce a huge amount of fresh produce, we then need to be doing land use planning to help protect other land for ecosystem services. So big area of land use planning, and I think that itself opens a whole new set of policy conversations and challenges. Secondly, and highly related to that one, if one of the benefits of the digital revolution in agriculture is to, say, encourage farmers to use technologies that absorb carbon or enhance carbon sequestration and some of the stuff that Terramera and Annett have been talking about, then I think the government has to enact policies such as carbon markets or other polluter pays mechanisms so that we actually have a regulatory system and a market system that reflects the costs or captures the costs of pollution. So that will create incentives for farmers to do better crop rotation and enhance soil organic matter to sequester carbon. And we're starting to see a little bit of that coming out of the market in terms of voluntary compliance. And here I think that Canadians should be grateful and proud for companies like Maple Leaf Foods, our largest food processor, that is now the world's first large food company that is carbon neutral. And they've been very, very disciplined and transparent about how they've made that claim and how they test that claim. I think if we created a decent carbon market or some sort of mechanism that puts a price on carbon and applied it to the food sector, more companies would be like Maple Leaf. Third, this has come up a couple of times. Investing in agriculture, if you're a venture capitalist, investing in ag technology is actually quite risky. It's way more challenging and way riskier. It takes a lot more time, for instance, to create a new variety of strawberries that grows inside than it does iterate on an app. And because we're dealing with living systems here, where weather plays a role and pathogens play a role. And I think there is a role, therefore, for policy and government to help de-risk the investments that go into this. And we could imagine how policies such as giving companies the ability to write off future incomes against capital investments in the sector. And I'm not lobbying for any specific policy instrument, but I think the broad area of de-risking investment would be the third. And then the fourth big area where I think policy needs to be invested is giving the universities and the colleges in Canada a little bit of a shot in the arm to help train the next generation. We are well served by a great network of colleges and universities that do agriculture, and they teach the traditional ag disciplines very well, soil science, animal husbandry, that kind of stuff. But to that, we also have to layer in much more STEM disciplines into that. So our ag scientists come out with a bit of a background in data engineering. And the corollary of that is that our computer science and engineering departments need to be drawing on agriculture as illustrative case studies, as opposed to defaulting, like they often do, to aerospace or automotive. We need more ag in the engineering schools. And then, but that's not enough either. So we need the disciplines of agriculture, we need the disciplines of STEM, but workplace study after workplace study tells us that students of the future, the leader of the future, also needs those foundational skills of conflict resolution, critical thinking, group work. And you yourself referenced the Royal Bank work from earlier in your remarks, and the Royal Bank has really put down some real strong benchmarks that our students need to have, our agricultural students need to have these foundational skills. So if we're going to try to imagine the curriculum of the future, we need to bring together ag, STEM, and foundational skills, which is a really radical change to how we teach students. And so land use planning, polluter pays mechanisms, de-risking investment, and a new approach to training. Those are the and along with the stuff that Will was talking about on data, those are the policy agendas I think that we need to embark on if we as a country are going to sort of realize that vision that the BC government's task force or the Advisory Council for Economic Growth laid out for us.
That's great. Evan, do you look to, is it too simple to say you look to the Netherlands or to Israel or to like, is it for particular, like you mentioned, 4 areas, or is each jurisdiction doing something different and you look to different countries for different ideas?
So different countries and different sectors, of course, right? So de-risking investment to, incentivize investing in a sector. I mean, Canada did that well. Controversially, of course, to empower the development of the oil sands in northern Alberta. I mean, that there was a very deliberate strategic strategy there to make it attractive to invest in the capital to develop that infrastructure. So we do have, say, a playbook in northern Alberta that could be applied to the ag sector in BC. Certainly, there's lots of good examples. California, for instance, on how to incorporate carbon markets into economies. I'm less certain there's good examples on how to do land use planning and integrate land use planning, but I'm sure we could scratch our heads and do that. And I'm going to point to work at the Netherlands, but also work we're doing at the University of Guelph on the training file, where we are explicitly trying to bring these different components together. And I've had good conversations just this summer with another of the BC Premier's task force members, Arvind Gupta, about exactly that. So I think there's lots of good examples, but what we need to do is be a little more high-level strategy on it and link it to a bold vision for a sustainable agricultural future.
It's great to mention, because there was an earlier question, the role of universities. It is about research and knowledge mobilization, but the education and training. And I know at SFU we're developing from scratch an agri-tech program and getting a really good response from industry on their needs. So Selena, policy is a big part of your world, and particularly with the task force, but just in general. And I'm really curious as to your answer on this question.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess a couple of things. One would be that for those that aren't familiar with the task force report, the Food Security Task Force had a mandate to look at how technology could influence economic growth for British Columbia and create sort of a new skilled job opportunity for British Columbians in terms of 2 distinct ways. One was looking at growing the actual opportunities out of agriculture and food processing, which aligned more closely with the Barton report. And then some was really just looking at the standalone development of a new sector in a niche area called agri-tech. So the 4 policy themes that came out of that report certainly align with what all my panelists are talking about. One that hasn't been talked about that I'll just mention is that their recommendation was to incorporate the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as we do seek to build out more robust agricultural policies linked to whether it's carbon pricing, climate pricing, and things like focusing on food security, food affordability. So it's a really interesting way of looking at the power of our food production systems and how they can advance a lot of things that are people, planet, profit. So the social good of this sector is something that I think we can't ignore in policy development. And I think we've got a real national play there as well. And so that's one policy area that I think we need to focus on. The second is on that innovation and incubation of innovation. Joanne, your question about where in the world is doing this well, I think you'd want us to cue a little bit on the work that is done in the Netherlands. Certainly Annett's mentioned that. And so I think one of the great policy lessons, both in the Netherlands and that I took away from Guelph, is I guess what they call that triple helix approach. And, right now we as government are extremely interested in developing this sector for all of the economic and social reasons that go along with it. And this was even before the pandemic. There was a high level of government interest and enthusiasm about this. So that's only been strengthened with what we've been experiencing. And so when you look at just the integration of how industry, informs what, researchers are working on, and they're actually looking to solve problems that are going to very quickly elevate the competitiveness of the industry, and that government can come in as an aggregator and a supportive entity to make sure that everyone is working towards a common strategy that's going to benefit everyone from a sector development and a company by company competitiveness pathway. So I think that triple helix, or that golden triangle, or whatever you want to call it, is something that we cannot lose sight of as we do develop policies in this area. The task force had a policy goal around academic and institution model. I believe that it's sort of mirrored after Evans Institute in Guelph there. And so looking at having more of those integrated bodies across the country and having those institutions speak to each other, I think what we want to achieve with our policy goals in this area is to put the world on signal that BC, Canada, we're a place that you can really be successful in agriculture. We're a place that's really welcome to agri-tech investment. And there's going to be a very supportive system of people that want to work in the sector and that we're training up to be your employees. There's a growing environment and a dedicated land base to do tech-enabled production. And there's this integrated system and a real willingness from across parts of the nation that will be welcoming here. So in terms of the academic piece, I think Evans covered that off very well, but obviously a huge part of the policy development to make sure we are preparing for Farmer 4.0. And then the other task force recommendation was with regards to land use planning and ensuring that we are able to look at future forms of food production and making sure, I think for me, a huge part of that policy development I've mentioned in my earlier comments is making sure that that makes sense logistically. So here in British Columbia, of course, we're strategically located in a port jurisdiction, so we've got access to overseas markets. But looking at some of those strategic opportunities to grow more food in a tech-enabled fashion closer to export position, I think is something else we need to incorporate into our policy development, as well as looking at if we're going to be growing food in more rural and remote areas, making sure that those people have a logistics and distribution network and path that is integrated. So I think collaboration is just absolutely key. Industry-led work is a term that I know has been coming up for a handful of years now. I know in Canada, we are not as strong in industry-led R&D in a lot of industries as they may be in the United States. And so taking a page out of the playbook in the Salinas Valley in California, what I would say is that I think we need to implement policies that make industry more a part of this revolution. We know that agriculture is, I guess, the least and the last digitized sector of the traditional sectors, and it makes sense around the world to be looking at ways to ensure that the people that actually are growing our food have a say in how they want to, kind of transition into the new era, and that there's enough support for that in a way that helps that, creates an opportunity for new interested applicants and entrants to the system. But I think that it's really got to be an industry conversation in collaboration with the other parts that we've talked about here. So for instance, I know in California, big companies, and we don't have necessarily those large companies here in British Columbia, but other parts of Canada do, really have more of a stake in that innovation. So I know Driscoll's Berries and the Taylor Salad Farms, they invest in innovation, they invest in the startup culture and the scale-up culture in that part of the world. And so some types of policies that can help us spur that growth. I think we'll see companies growing faster. I think we'll see companies growing larger, which is good for being able to provide more employment as a major sector. I think that will help this sector come out of sort of its nascent stage as, is it agri-tech? Is it food production? And really kind of help us develop a recognizable and globally competitive brand in agri-tech development. So that's kind of where I will like to be focusing as soon as I have a government mandate in place. In British Columbia here, we do remain in a bit of a extended interregnum state. So I'm trying to be careful about not overshooting any policy goals that I don't have the authority to do right now. But that's the things we've been talking about. That's what's contained in the recommendations of the Food Security Task Force. And those are some of the best practices, certainly, that I've seen from other jurisdictions as well.
It's interesting to think about when it'll be where agri-tech is not a word. It's because agricultural sector is already using technologies, so into the future. Selena, Renee Claude asked the question about the role of farmers unions or farmers associations. Has that did that play a role in sort of submissions to the task force, or maybe other panelists could comment on that? And they were just talking about kind of who represents the interests of farmers at the policy level in agri-tech recovery. And they also, Renee also referenced about tech adoption and co-development and multidisciplinarity sort of approaches, and farmers unions maybe being a vital link between innovators, the STEM ecosystem, and the community of farmers scientists.
So in terms of the work of the task force.
Oh, your audio is just a bit low.
Oh, sorry. Is that any better?
A little bit low.
Maybe one of my panelists wants to jump in while mine comes back. Is that better?
Panelists want to jump in about the role of farmer unions or organizations? Evan?
Yeah, well, certainly farmer organizations have played a vital role, and farmers unions have played a vital role over the summer in particular around the whole issue of the temporary foreign workers and COVID. And I've spent a bit of time this summer facilitating a process that touched with the Canadian Agriculture Human Rights Council and the Canadian Federation of Agriculture to try to really understand how the problems with the temporary foreign worker program emerged and what the solution is. And my feeling very strongly is twofold. One, the technology revolution that we're talking about will be incredibly disruptive. And you know, many of the people on this call right now are sounding quite excited about it. And I am excited about it, but I'm also aware that if I was a beef farmer, for instance, the creation of alternative proteins, or if I was a temporary foreign worker, or I was a horticultural farmer, the advent of controlled environment automation would be incredibly disruptive to my livelihood and to that of my family, and drive enormous anxiety. So one of the things we have to do is we have to be, at the same time as embracing these technological headwinds and trying to point ourselves in the direction that the technology is heading, is also very respectfully and with a tremendous amount of collaboration, work with the farmer groups to develop appropriate ways of managing the technological trends. And we in this country have examples of resource structures that have collapsed overnight, like the cod fishery, that were done, you know, it happened very, very quickly and with tremendous, you know, horror and anguish for the families that were embedded in the old way of doing things. And we now have an opportunity to say, okay, these technologies are coming. We want to be a leader in these technologies, and we owe it to the producer, we owe it to our fellow Canadians to work with the producer groups in order to manage this transition. And so I think it's in terms of managing transition and developing pathways of development that work with the farmers groups and the unions and whatnot will play the most important role.
Selena, I don't know if your audio is working.
How's that, you guys?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, great. So I guess sort of echoing what Evan's comments are, yes, of course, we did engage with the associations here in British Columbia when we did the work of the task force. And just to that extent, a lot of the farm groups were really kind of focused on their immediate problems and not potentially looking at technology as the primary solution to address immediate problems that are related to climate change. So really kind of continuing to work in collaboration to help with the education, de-risking, and showing what is going to be possible is a big opportunity area for continuing to work with those groups. But also I think that having sort of that proximity, so having more technology innovators located sort of in the agricultural heartlands is a piece that I'm really interested in seeing come to light here in British Columbia. So right now, you know, if we've got a lot of companies located in urban parts of our cities, Vancouver, downtown, for instance, And then most of our growing is out sort of in the Fraser Valley, which is, nearly a 2-hour drive. I'd like to see those groups getting a lot more integrated so that we can start to build up the confidence and have those farm groups and unions become advocates, and then start that two-way dialogue where they're really giving us the real near-term and longer-term issues for their sector. They're also open to receiving the research from the universities on what those long-term opportunities and threats are likely to be. And then just kind of moving towards that three-way piece, I think is going to be a massive role for those associations.
And just a quick question, I guess, for Evan. There was a kind of a suggestion or question about, do we need to do more promotion in high schools to attract students to this field? Are you seeing good enrollments programs, especially if they're including agri-tech? Or do we need to do something, and they reference the trades promotions that we've done at the school level?
Oh, I think we need to do more. It's an endless source of frustration to me that when I'm in, say, a group of young people and I say advanced manufacturing and everybody thinks computer chips, or I say robotics and everybody thinks NASA, and I say public health and everybody thinks pharmacy or medicine. And actually, I think there's a shorter line to a good job for young people through food to all of those sectors. And so, I've been working with folks like Lenore Newman, and other sort of aligned colleagues across Canada on working to get these messages out into high schools. I do a lot of work with the NGO Agscape and Ag in the Classroom to put materials in front of teachers in the grade 11 and 12 kind of zone, just as kids are making their decisions as to what fields to go into. So it's a bit of a personal project of passion for me, which is to raise the profile of these things, because I think that, gosh, there's good jobs, and the Ontario Ag College at the University of Guelph likes to brag that there's 4 jobs for every graduate that we have. So there's good jobs in the sector, the employment, there's a labor shortage in the sector, and it's a part of the moral mission of making the world more sustainable. So I think there's everything in it for a young person, and I'm a little frustrated that more people don't see that at the age of 17 or 18.
Yeah, and someone did comment that you mentioned Agriscape in Ontario is working on promoting agricultural studies and careers to encourage them to enter the sector. So in the remaining time, we are going to turn to Sam at the very end to show us this amazing drawing that he's provided. But I'll go to each panelist and allow you some flexibility. There's still some, there's a question, and we have touched on partnerships across, university, college, industry, and government, and what role they play particularly in bridging the technology communities and the agricultural sector. Someone wanted panelists to share the top 3 or more strengths, and they referenced BC, but I'm aware that this is there's people here from across Canada, but the strengths where we can lead in agri-tech on a global level, for example, precision agriculture. Or if you just want to comment on the discussion we've had today and highlight a few areas that you want to comment further on. So I'll turn it to Annett first for comments on any of these areas where we can lead globally, the kind of partnerships or innovative partnerships models, or just comments that you'd like to make at this time.
Yeah, I'd like to chance to make another comment. I want to loop back to the carbon market idea that Evan has brought up. In my opinion, the carbon markets could be a huge way to incentivize the use of new technology in agriculture, specifically to promote regenerative agriculture. So what I had talked about, pulling back the carbon dioxide from the air. And so just to give you some numbers, Canada emits approximately 0.7 gigatons of carbon per year. However, if we were to make use of the entire landmass of Canada, we could sequester 78 gigatons of CO2 equivalents by 2050 through scaling regenerative farming. And that could bring Canada beyond net zero. So we could totally achieve, our commitments under the various climate agreements that we made. And so right now, our carbon markets are too small to support those kinds of numbers. Like, I think we're in the kind of hundreds of millions of dollars carbon market. But really what our land mass, our size of agriculture can support is more like the hundreds of billions. And so we need a scaling factor there. And so I'm not sure, I don't even think every province in Canada has a carbon market or, shares a carbon market right now. So using that as a vehicle to, promote agri-technology and using it in a way that, makes us a leader in turning back the clock on climate change globally, that is a great vehicle to accomplish that.
Great, thank you. Will.
Just been thinking about the sort of top 3 strands where we can see BC can lead. So I grew up in BC and but have gone to Quebec and gone to Maryland for education. And one thing I do see that BC has strengths overall in its education system is that we're fairly small yet fairly nimble, and we are also willing to work with each other. And that often translate to small projects that are funded one-off by, say, Genome BC or Genome Canada, or by government grants, especially federal government grants in agriculture. But I think the area that we can excel is that we need to take this a step further and start thinking strategically how to translate these innovations into implementation. So for example, the avian flu project that I mentioned, we had 2 years of funding from Genome BC, and we got a proof of concept research done. But then, for example, to implement it, we're now at the implementation stage, and we're working closely with the Ministry of Agriculture to carry out the implementation. But in that process, there's always personnel supports and other costs, such as education and training, that will need to be put in place. So to improve the condition of and taking advantage of the initial R&D and take into implementation, I think it's suitable for implementation in a province like BC, where again we are small yet very nimble in taking up some of the high-tech activities. So I guess that's not 3, but that's what I thought would be a good area for BC to focus on. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Will. Selena, I'll turn to you next.
Great, thank you very much. So I think just in closing, I would say that it sounds like, from my fellow panelists, there's certainly an interest in continuing to collaborate and put forward a strategy that's going to be able to help young people see a path forward for themselves to be gainfully employed and employed in a really important sector that's going to support our food security as well as social good. So I'm very, very keen to keep this conversation going. I hope that for those that have been listening to the discussion, they see that this is, it sounds choppy in some ways, and in some ways it sounds disaggregated. And so I think that in terms of partnerships, those of us from government, academia, and industry have a role to play in helping be an aggregator and create the story in the space for people to move into and play a role in helping this sector develop. I know that at the University of Guelph, they have been doing a lot of work in this sector for, Evan's mentioned, decades, but as a term itself in agri-tech, it's still a relatively new sector. And so I think we're at a bit of a turning point where we will be, realizing this is a large opportunity that's going to include and incorporate a lot of us. in terms of specific areas that there should be opportunities in for people to find themselves, I think that in terms of a skilled operation of technologies that can be implemented within greenhouse systems, I think that's a big area of opportunity. I think increasing the growing season for some of our very high valued crops through the use of technology, things like blueberries, cherries, is going to be an area that we can focus on and that can support skilled jobs. And then because we've got technology development here in British Columbia very deeply established, looking at the application of things like AI and machine learning and data analytics, and applying that really specifically to agriculture is an area of opportunity, as well as has been discussed robustly on this call. But overall, I think that this conversation illustrates, hopefully from government's perspective, that one of the strengths that British Columbia and Canada can bring to this in helping to kind of charge ahead and become really globally competitive and globally known as a place that does this and does it well, is that we've got the will to do so. So we've got a policy intention to do so. We've got a meaningful approach to collaboration. We've got the reports and the visions, and now we need strategy and execution. And I think that that in itself sends a really positive signal to create a pathway for investment that will in turn generate jobs and revenues and enhance opportunities for us all. So that would be sort of my closing comment, Joanne.
Great. Thank you for those great words. And Evan, we're going to close on your comments.
Well, it's nice of you. And thanks again for the invitation. Hey, I think I would like to leave everyone with both a sense of optimism, but also a sense of tempered realism. These technologies that we're getting kind of breathless about are not a panacea. No technology ever is. And nothing comes for free. So I guess my first big concluding point is that we need to be conscious and cognizant of the fact that a lot of stuff has to happen to enable the technologies to meet their potential. And we also have to manage very carefully and with a lot of respect the very real human consequences of disruptive technologies. And I'm specifically thinking about how rural communities, remoter communities, and the farm sector are going to manage this change. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'd just like to give a shout out to Selena and Peter Dill and Arvind Gupta, Lenore Newman, who's a very good friend. And I think what you folks did with the BC Premier's Task Force is exactly what we need to be doing. And I just think that's worth recognizing. So that's my second point. My third concluding point is, if we want to realize the benefits of this digital agriculture revolution, we need to get data sorted out and data governance and interoperability. We need to make sure the environment and the environmental costs of food production are included in the transactional costs. And that means we need better land use planning, and we need that carbon market Annett was talking about. We need to de-risk investment so that venture capital flows more easily into this space. And finally, we need a radical new approach, I think, to training. But those are all tractable. There's nothing impossible or airy-fairy or aspirational about those four policy domains. That's sort of humdrum, mundane policy development. But I think that's necessary if we want to realize this. And the final thing I'd say is to maybe move back from realism into aspirational. I really believe that we have a front row seat on what is the biggest change that I can imagine. It is one of the biggest changes in human history, one of the biggest changes since the Industrial Revolution, which is the application of digital tools to food and farming systems. Properly done, this will make us healthier and live longer. This will possibly save the planet and will create jobs, but only if we do the sort of the humdrum policy work to create the enabling structures, and we are aware of these broad issues. But boy, I think this is an exciting sector to work in. Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank Annett, Will, Selena, and you, Evan, for an amazing concentrated hour-and-a-half discussion highlighting opportunities, but also challenges and key areas of strength. But it's been a very rich discussion for participants. This has been videoed and you'll have access to this. Panelists made the generous offer to, you could reach out to them if you'd like further information. Evan, you mentioned the BC Food Security Task Force report, which is available online and is just such an excellent kind of overview and read and strategy. So I encourage you to do so. And I'm now going to turn it to Sam to walk us through the graphical illustration of what we've said.
Thanks, everyone. What an incredible, incredible panel. I too am all fired up now about the potential for Farmer 4.0, was it? This is great. So I wanted to just let people know how the image has been created, recognizing that there's many kinds of farming and agriculture out there. I did go with a traditional one because I wanted to contrast the big machines with the other machines over here. And so across the bottom, we've got data integration, interoperability, and then collaboration with a person-centered relationship in the middle, because really it does come back to the people. And so throughout the image, which will be on Twitter momentarily at the SFU Research Twitter, we've got posing of the problem. We're going to need more food on less land use. We're going to need to be able to work together. This call for implementation, bringing people closer together. Some of the barriers, including cost, we need scalable solutions, we need more choices for farmers, an aging workforce, but we can use tech to attract new farmers. Basically, it was a very solutions-focused panel, so there's just lists and lists of good ideas to implement, including polluter pay markets, the interdisciplinary education around ag and STEM and foundational skills, and this framework of One Health relating also to the genomic analysis that's also required. At the end here, we've got a person, maybe she's working in a northern climate. Maybe this is the Inuvik greenhouse that I visited last year, but she's a farmer and a scientist saying that she shouldn't have to pay to get her data back because she knows that northern solutions and farming solutions can help meet our climate goals because Canada will be ready. So that's a very, very fast walkthrough. But again, the graphic will be available. I know everyone has put in a great deal of time and effort to this panel, and I want to respect that we're at the mark. So thank you very much. See you soon.
Great job, Sam. And thank you to all the participants that joined us. I think we're all walking away really excited about how we can harness agri-tech to really achieve a sustainable and more resilient food systems and help in the COVID business recovery as well. So thank you everyone for joining us, and you'll see the tweet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great panel.
Thank you.